Hello and welcome to this session on how to build web applications and optimize the user interface for mobile devices with RadPHP XE2. My name is Al Manarino and I'm one of the Embarcadero software consultants. During this session, I'll show you the new mobile app project wizard and the mobile page item in RadPHP XE2. I'll show you the integrated jQuery mobile components to allow you to develop optimized web applications for mobile devices. And then after we build the mobile applications, I'll walk you through the wizard for PhoneGap to create the native mobile applications for both iOS devices, iPhone, iPad, and iPod Touch, Android devices, and BlackBerry devices. And then for a demonstration, I'll show you how you can use RadPHP XE2 to create a new mobile app and display the data from a database onto a jQuery mobile mlist component. Then we'll deploy and upload the application onto an Android device, and we can do the same thing for an iOS device like an iPhone or a BlackBerry device. And then after the demonstration, I'll give you a quick summary on what's new in RadPHP XE2. And lastly, we'll have time at the end to answer any questions you might have. RadPHP XE2 adds a new mobile application project and a new mobile page item. Now, RadPHP XE2 adds these 37 jQuery mobile components so that you can create rich, accessible, touch-friendly websites and apps on the popular Android, iOS, and BlackBerry mobile device platforms. So here we see the 20 mobile hardware components like the accelerometer and the camera, and the 17 mobile components like an M button and an M list. Now, just in case you are unfamiliar with jQuery mobile, so first we had jQuery as a very popular JavaScript library for creating rich, interactive websites and web apps. However, since it was designed primarily for desktop browsers, it doesn't have many features specifically designed for building mobile web apps. Now, jQuery Mobile, built from jQuery, is a new project that addresses this jQuery shortfall. So it's a framework built on top of jQuery that provides a range of user interface elements and features for you to use in your mobile apps. Now, after we create our mobile app using the RadPHP XE2 IDE, then we'll use this new wizard for PhoneGap to generate all the files we need to create a native mobile app based on web technologies. So we'll be able to create apps for iOS devices, iPhone, iPad, iPod Touch, Android, and BlackBerry devices. So that's very cool. And just in case you are unfamiliar with PhoneGap, PhoneGap is a HTML5 app platform that allows you to author native applications with web technologies and get access to APIs and app stores. PhoneGap leverages web technologies we developers already know best, HTML and JavaScript. And PhoneGap is an open source implementation of open standards. So that means developers and companies can use PhoneGap for mobile apps that are free, commercial, open source, or any combination of these. And the PhoneGap project will always remain free and open source under a MIT license. Now we'll get into the demonstration. So for this RadPHP XE2 jQuery mobile demonstration, we're going to build a new mobile app that uses a mlist component to display data on our mobile device. And after we build the application, we're going to use the wizard for PhoneGap to generate the files for an Android device, and we'll run the application on an Android emulator. And that emulator is included inside of RadPHP XE2 also. So here we are in our RadPHP XE2 IDE. And now for this demonstration, we are going to create a new mobile application that uses a jQuery mobile mlist component to display data from a database onto our mobile device. And then after we create the application, we're going to use our wizard for PhoneGap to generate the files for either an Android device, an iOS device, or a BlackBerry device. And then we can run our mobile app on a device emulator or upload the app onto our device and run it on the actual mobile device itself. So that's pretty cool. So now the first thing we need to do is to create a new mobile app. So to do that, it's under File, New, Other, and click Mobile Application and say OK. So now by doing this, our mobile app gets created, and we see on the tool palette all of our jQuery mobile components. And we also have the options to select different types of devices we want to create the application for. So for example, right now I'm looking at an Android Galaxy S2 horizontal. I also have options to pick it vertically. Other options I see here are for BlackBerry. So I have a BlackBerry 3850 and a BlackBerry 9810. So we get the images for that. And I also have the images for the iPhones and the iPads also. So if I wanted to create this application for an iPad, this is what it looks like on the screen. Or a Motorola Zoom tablet. I have all those images here also. And I'm also given the option to add any other type of device that's available to me. So by clicking the Add New Device, I can put in the background image of whatever mobile app device I want to write this application again. So that's also pretty cool. Now for me, since I'm the new owner of an Android Samsung Galaxy S2 phone, I'm going to select it for my project. So I'm going to select Android Samsung Galaxy S2. That gets added to my project. So now recall what we want this application to do is, so now I want my Android device to connect to a backend database and get data and display it on my phone. So to do that, I'm going to use an mlist component from my jQuery mobile component. So from my tool palette, I'm going to select an mlist component and drop it onto the form. And since I have all this great real estate on my Samsung Galaxy S2 phone, I'm going to make my mlist quite large and fill about 3/4 of the phone like this. So that's great. Now all of these jQuery mobile components, both the mobile components and the mobile hardware components, are documented inside of RadPHP under Help. So if you look up the mlist component, you'll see it's a dynamic list that we can fill up with data, either entered manually, or we can set up a database connection and retrieve the data from a database. So that's what we're going to do. So to get our data, we're going to use a database connection. And for the database I'm going to use the sample OS Commerce database that's included inside of RadPHP. So from our Data Explorer, I'm going to select the OS Commerce database, and the table I want to use is the categories table. So I'm going to select the categories table, and I'm going to drag it onto our form, just like that. So that's pretty cool. So we see by dropping the categories table onto our mobile device, this added 4 components onto my page. So we have a database component, a table component, a data source component, and a database grid component. Now I want to run this application to test my connection. So I'll go up here and say run this application. So before I can run the application, it's asking me to save the application. So I'm going to put this into a new folder. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this my RadPHP Android application. I'll give the first unit 1. And for its project's name, I'm going to also call it my RadPHP Android project. And say OK to that. So now that it's saved, it's going to start up a PHP Apache web server, connect to my backend database, and in our database grid, yes indeed, we do see information from the categories table. So that's great. So this was a really good test to verify that we can connect and get data returned from our categories table. So that's also great. So now I'm going to close out my web page and return back into my IDE. So for this DB grid component, since I don't need the DB grid for our mobile application because we want our data to be displayed on this mlist component, I'm going to delete this component. So for DB grid, I'm going to delete it. So what I want to do is I want to write a SQL statement to get data from our tables and display that data on our mlist component. So to do that, I'm going to add a query component onto my form. So searching for query component, there's a query component under data access, and I want to add that to my form. So I'm going to drop a query component onto my form. And in this query component, I want to set its database property to be equal to our OS Commerce database. And I want to set its active property to be true. Now, on this same query component, if I look at its SQL property, so here's where I want to write my SQL that's going to return all of the categories in my database. And then when I click on one of those categories, I want it to drill down to the subcategories in that database table. And I want this for English types of description. So that's the type of SQL I want to write. So that's what I want to do next. Now, I'm not that familiar with this OS Commerce database and its tables. So I'm going to use Data Explorer and its SQL window to help me figure out more about this OS Commerce database. So I'm going to use the SQL window capability here. And I know I'm going to need information from the categories table and the categories description table. And I want to join these two tables together by its categories ID. So categories ID in categories gets joined to categories ID in categories description. So this is my entity relationship diagram between the two tables and their relationships. And looking at the SQL code that's going to produce, so by doing that relationship, it says I'm going to select everything from categories and then do an inner join on the categories description. And then when I run this query, it gives me this data. So here's all my category names and their category descriptions. So by looking at the data and what I want to do in this application. So for my application, I want to first display all the high level or the top level category names like hardware and software. And then when I select one of these, I want to drill down to its subcategory. So for example, when I select hardware on my mobile device, I want to drill down to its graphics card subcategory and continue doing that until there are no more subcategories left. And by looking at the data, I see parent ID decides, who's the top level category. So hardware has a parent ID of 0, and then the next subcategory underneath it has a parent ID of 1. So this was very helpful for me. So now knowing this information, I can now write my SQL for the SQL I need for my application. So let's do that next. So I want to start with the SQL code I have here as a starting point and bring this into my query SQL component in my IDE and then modify it for the type of query I want to write. So I'm going to copy the SQL. I no longer need to be in my SQL window. I don't need to save this. I'm going to once again go into my query component into the SQL, and this is the SQL I want to start with. So now I want to modify this SQL to give me a query that's going to return all of the categories and all of their subcategories for the language being English. So that's how I want to modify this next. Alright, so I still want to select everything from categories, but instead of doing an inner join, I really want to do a left join on the categories description, and then I want to join both the categories description table with the categories table by its category ID, and I only want to return results where the language is equal to 1, and that would be English. So instead of this query here, I'm going to replace it with this query, which is going to do that for me. So this query is going to return all of the categories and their subcategories for language ID equals 1. That's English, and that's great, and that's what I want. So I'll say OK to that, and that query gets saved in my SQL property under my query component. So that's done. All right, so now to get the results of my query to return on my mlist component, I'm going to select mlist, and for its data source component, I'm going to set that to my data source categories component. And then inside of that data source component for the data set, instead of returning back the entire table, instead I want to return the results of our query and get those results onto our mlist. Now, next thing I need to do is set my data mappings. So data mappings on my mlist component needs to correspond to my database table values to display on the mlist. So the first thing I want to do for the a base parent field. I want to set that to be 0. Next, for the caption, so this 0, this is going to be the first value or the first column to display on our M list. That's what the 0 means. For caption, a caption is going to be what we want to use for each element on the M list. So in this case, it's going to be my category name. So that's categories, my category's name. So that will be the caption. Next, for the ID field, I want this to be equal to my category's ID. And lastly, I need to establish the parent field. So the parent field is going to be my parent ID. And that's done. So now I have my database mappings in place. I can now run this application, and let's see if the M list displays my category values. So this is great so far. So now I'm going to run this application, and by running the application, we should be connecting to our backend database, calling the categories and category descriptions table, and displaying the high-level categories on our M list like we see here. So that works great. So now when I click on these high-level top-level categories, it should drill down into its subcategories such as graphics cards. So that's working great. So now that we have our application working fine inside of RadPHP XE2, we now want to create a mobile app that's going to display this data on either an Android, iOS, or a BlackBerry device. So now for this mobile application, we're not going to put our database, nor can we process the PHP files on this mobile device. So we're going to have this application make some AJAX calls to another application that's hosted on a server, and that's going to provide us the data. So the first thing we need to do is to tell our main application to use AJAX, and let me do that now next. For my M page component, we have a property called useAjax, and I want to set the useAjax property to be true. Next, I want to set or establish the Ajax URI. So that's the useAjax URI property, and that's what we're going to use to connect to and collect the data. So for this property, I need to give it the IP address and the port that we want to connect to. So for this property, you do not want to use localhost. You want to use the real IP address to connect to, such as if I was running a PHP Apache server on Windows, it would be the output from running the IP config command. So for this application, I'm going to use the IP address and the port we've been using in this example, and that is IP address 192.168.74.128, listening on port 3571, and it's going to call our first unit1.php that we've been using in this example. So now that I have that set, I'm going to save all. I'm going to run the application again now, but this time it's going to be using AJAX and connecting to our AJAX URI to connect to and collect the data and display it on our M list like we see here. So that's working great. So now I'm going to come out of my web page. Now next, we're going to use our Wizard for PhoneGap feature to create our mobile app. So here I have the option of either creating an iOS device, an Android device, or a BlackBerry mobile app. And this wizard is going to generate all the files we need to create our native iOS, Android, or BlackBerry mobile app based on web technologies. So for me, I'm going to create this as an Android application. So I'll select Android and say Next. Now here on the application setup page, the index page, this is going to be our index1 PHP from our current project. For the application name, let me simply call it my PHP Android application, and for company name I'm going to leave it as Embarcadero and say Next. Here on the Android graphics page, Here we can adjust the Android graphics for the images that will show up on our phone for the application we are running. But in this case, I'm just going to leave it as default and say next. And then finally here on my target destination page, it's asking me, do I want to compile this in debug mode or do I want to compile this in release mode? So in debug mode, it will allow me to side load it into my Android device or run it inside of a simulator without first needing to register to the Android market to do so. So I'm going to select debug. And the last thing I need to do on this page is to select a destination folder for my generated Android files. So in this case, I'm going to put them in my PHP Android folder and say next. Now, at this point, all of my Android files get generated in the Android PHP folder, and that's great. So as we look at these files, we see they are files from Web Technologies, JavaScript files, cascading style sheets, and HTML files. So that's all great. So now when I say next, because we integrated the Android Developer Toolkit into RadPHP, I can now choose to either run this inside an emulator or my real Android device. So if I had my Samsung Galaxy S2 USB connected to my laptop right now, I could actually have it upload the application to my actual Android, and it'll actually run inside of my Android Galaxy S2. But in this case, I'm going to run it in a simulator, so I'm going to pick Android version 2.31 to run it in, and I'm going to say next. Now at this point, it's going to run the Android ADB server. It's going to set up the Android SDK tools. It's going to compile the files into Java classes. It's going to create the final Android APK file that I can use to upload into my Android device. And at the end of this, it's going to wait for either my live device to be available or it's going to start the Android simulator as we see here. So the Android simulator is starting up now. Our application has been loaded. We are going to open the Android simulator. So our application gets loaded and we should see our home page get displayed. So there's our top level components displayed. So now when I click on one of these components, it makes that AJAX call to our backend database and retrieves the subcategories. So that's great. So very powerful what we can do here. All right, I'll close down my Android simulator and say finish to my PhoneGap Wizard. So now let's do the same thing now using PhoneGap, but in this case, let's create it as an iOS device. So iOS, I'm going to pick iOS version, let's say 4.3, and say next. And just like we saw before, index page stays the same. In this case, instead of calling it Android project, I'll call it PHP iOS project. Company name will still be Embarcadero. And here, for an iOS device, if you had your Apple Developer ID, you can add it right now. That's going to sign the app and prepare it for submission to the App Store. So that's pretty powerful also right here. Say next. Here, once again, the iOS graphics, I can adjust them here. The icons, the splash screen, that's all customizable by you, the user. I'm going to say next. And once again, give me a target destination to put the files. Let me go ahead and select a new destination folder. I'll hang it off of my libraries, documents, my documents, and I'm going to put this in my PHP iOS folder and say next. So here now all of the iOS files are being created for me. So what's being created here is an Xcode project. So now I can take these files created here and bring them up to my Mac and run them inside of an Xcode IDE and simulate this running inside of an iPhone or an iPad. So let me do that next really quickly. All right, so now I'm going to switch out of my full screen mode and in a single window, because my environment right now, I'm running my RadPHP XE2 inside of a VMware Fusion partition inside of my MacBook Pro. So the Xcode project we just created from RadPHP XE2, I now have inside of my Xcode IDE simulator on my Mac. So I want to run that application inside of an iPhone. So at this point, it's going to build the project. It's going to fire up the iOS simulator. It's going to load the app, and there it is. So that's great. So we just saw how we can take the single code base out of PHP and create an Android application and also create an iOS application. And we can do the same thing for a BlackBerry application. So that's a very powerful feature of using RadPHP XE2 with the jQuery mobile components and the wizard for PhoneGap. So that's really nice. Okay, we're back in my RadPHP XE2, and we just saw how you can use RadPHP XE2 to build and deploy mobile web apps very easily. And I can also use RadPHP XE2 to create great web and Facebook applications also. So in conclusion, we just saw why RadPHP XE2 is the fastest way to build and deploy mobile web apps, and it can also be used to build great looking web and Facebook applications also. So in this session, we quickly saw using RadPHP XE2 with jQuery mobile visual component-based development of mobile optimized web pages, and using PhoneGap, we saw how easily you could create iOS, Android, and BlackBerry apps that you can sell on the Apple, Android, and BlackBerry app stores. And in addition to the jQuery mobile and PhoneGap features we just saw, RadPHP XE2 also adds additional Zend framework components for email, feeds, Google Docs, and so much more. So thank you for attending this session. Now we're going to open up the session to any questions you might have.